Now, the United States, with their recent increase of 30,000 troops in Afghanistan, is seeking a more enemy-centric counterinsurgency plan, because the goals that we have to meet in Afghanistan have to be realized as a certain group of goals that we can actually meet. For instance, the current conflict in Afghanistan is primarily an ethnic conflict. And by an ethnic conflict, the problem there is that even if you commit the entire United States military, we stay there forever, we get rid of all violence. If we leave after a year, the conflict will return. It's an ethnic conflict. It has to be solved by the people of that country. So that's one thing we can't solve. That's the Afghan people have to solve. Now, on the other hand, what we do have to do is make sure that Afghanistan does not go back to being a safe haven for terrorists, which was the reason why we went in the first place. And we have to achieve that goal. And part of that, to achieve that, you have to have a stable government in Afghanistan to make sure they can administer all the different regions of that country effectively. And so our main goal is to establish a secure and stable government, not comprised of radical elements of the Taliban, but is also democratically elected. What we need to do is make sure there's a semblance of security and an ability for the government there to work on building and working on their infrastructure, working on their police force. What the American military is doing right now is working heavily on building up Afghani police and military forces so they can take over effectively after we leave in 2011. This is one of the major things we have to do there. One of the biggest problems we have to address is that when we leave, what will the general mood of the country be after we leave? Will we have a nation where the people will accept radicals back into their midst or not? Because that's a key factor in whether or not we succeeded in Afghanistan. So definitely part of that is also about how we create political support for the United States and the Afghani government in that country. And a lot of that has to do with the recent American efforts to reduce civilian casualties. Now, it's a war, so there have been major slip-ups, and there have been a lot of problems with this recently. It's a very difficult conflict, but NATO forces led by the United States really have to work on weeding out the strongholds of the Taliban and working on getting the Afghani government to get the support of their people, who right now, frankly, have no support in that government. So that is one of our major goals in that country, and that's something that I think we can do in the next year.
Thank you, Mr. Lombardi. 2 minutes.
Okay, in response to the Afghanistan surge, whether it would work or not, I can't predict the future. If I could, I'd be out playing Powerball right now. I wouldn't be here. But the best data that we can use to examine the upcoming surge in Afghanistan is the surge we initiated in Iraq in 2007, which the Afghanistan surge is modeled on. The Afghanistan surge calls to add 30,000 troops on the ground in Afghanistan. In Iraq, it was 27,000, done in the middle of 2007 by General Petraeus. Looking at the data which came out of Iraq, first of all, my opponent has erred in saying that Afghanistan is primarily an ethnic conflict. In fact, Iraq is primarily an ethnic conflict. Afghanistan is a conflict where insurgents are pouring from other countries, predominantly trained by Iran, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban themselves, who have not been imposed. Looking at the data from the surge in Iraq, civilian casualties in Iraq before the surge were over 3,000 individuals a month. By the middle of 2008, during the height of the surge, those casualties had dropped to under 200 and have since fallen even further. U.S. troop deaths in Iraq hit levels that were under that of the beginning of the war. So can we say the surge in Iraq worked? Yes, I believe we can. President Obama himself admitted a few days after taking over office in a conversation with General Petraeus that he feels the surge in Iraq worked. Whether this exact same model would work in Afghanistan, no one knows. But going on a similar war, in a similar climate, I'd say it is definitely a good start. Afghanistan is a war we cannot afford to or be willing to lose. If we succeed in creating a stable democracy in Afghanistan, we will create an ally of the United States in an area where we sorely need them. We need to reduce our casualties to nothing. Obviously, this is a goal that cannot be attained in practice, but the surge has worked in Iraq, and I feel it will work in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry, but it is an ethnic conflict in Afghanistan. There are rebels coming from Turkmenistan, the Pashtun rebels in Afghanistan. The Taliban is made up of different ethnic groups. Afghanistan has been racked by ethnic conflict for decades. So yes, it is actually an ethnic conflict. Something which we cannot get embroiled in, as that will only lead to a waste of American lives and precious resources at a time when we, like you said, have have a lot of serious goals to meet. Which is why I think it was a good step to also to include the 30,000 troops we're going to withdraw, I think by October 2011, to have all American troops withdrawn from Afghanistan. This is to ensure, it's to send a message to the Afghani government, like, hey, we are going to be here to help you, we're going to train your troops, we're going to go after the strongholds in Kandahar and whatnot, we're going to go after the enemy, try to weed out the Taliban, but it's up to you to take over the country in a year. And this is something that a lot of counterterrorism, a lot of insurgency experts have
going to do that. That was your man.
What?
Did you hear me now? 15? Sorry, I'll knock harder. Did you hear the bell?
You didn't hear about your name.
All right. Last question will be directed to Mr. Lombardi. You'll have 3 minutes. The United States is one of a handful of nations that has not signed the Kyoto Protocol, the international agreement to reduce greenhouse gases in the environment. What should the United States do internationally and or at home, if anything, to combat climate change and or become less dependent on foreign oil?
Well, this is a good point. First of all, I agree that we did not sign the Kyoto Protocol. That was one of the few things, in my opinion, that George Bush had completely right. The Kyoto Protocol would have been not only hideously expensive, it wouldn't have done anything to really reduce global warming or carbon emissions. The Kyoto Protocol would have just simply been a whole new system of taxes, tariffs, and restrictions on free enterprise, which would have just did ungodly damage to our economy. As for dependence on foreign oil, I don't think there is anybody in this country who wouldn't agree that we need to break ourselves from our dependence on foreign oil. But to break ourselves from our dependence on foreign oil, we need to do this immediately, and we need to do this with the technology we have now. We have to drill the oil in the United States. We have to drill decades of oil in Alaska, Texas, and off our coasts, which Fidel Castro and companies owned by the state of Cuba are allowed to drill in our waters, but our own corporations can't, because of antiquated laws that prevent us from harvesting our own natural resources. Now, our country needs to do more. Oil will run out. We need to build alternative forms of power, and that includes solar, wind, geothermal, and nuclear. Nuclear power is one of the cleanest sources of power available. It generates tremendous amounts of power, and modern nuclear reactors are some of the safest methods of power generation on this planet. We have not built a nuclear reactor in the United States since 1979. The majority of our current ones operating are over 40 years old and will be going offline in the next decade. This is something we cannot be willing to let see. We cannot watch our infrastructure crumble into the ground. As for oil, we may wonder why gas prices are so high. When Bill Clinton took office in the 1990s, this country had over 600 operating oil refineries. Oil refineries generate gasoline, diesel fuel, and other refined fuel products from crude oil. After Mr. Clinton left office in 2001, we had 120. We are now under 100. With each refinery closing, it drives up the price of gas. We now have to buy finished crude products from overseas. Not just buying oil anymore from the Saudis, we're buying tankers of finished gasoline. We are being held hostage by foreign countries, many of which do not, in any way, like the United States. This country needs new infrastructure. We need to build, and we need to drill. We need to build power plants, we need to build nuclear energy stations, we need to build wind stations, thermal stations, solar stations, and we need to unchain the businesses of America. We need to let them find new and innovative solutions to all of the crises facing our country. This is what allowed America to become